The Hindenburg and Me, written by Sherman Yellen, narrated by Robert Armin.
The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flame. It bursts into flame and it's falling. It's crashing. Watch it. Watch it. Get out of the way. Get out of the way. Get it started. Get it started. It's fire and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh, my. Get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, the humanity and all the prayers are just screaming.
Most of us stumble into great events unaware that they have happened to us until we learn of their importance in the world. This was as true to a passerby on a clear day in downtown Manhattan on September 11th, 2001, as it was to me, a small child in Lakehurst, New Jersey, on a fateful evening in 1937.
My mother was a passionate believer in a change of scenery, placing her faith in the healing powers of an ocean or a piney woods to cure my father's periodic depression, relieve my childhood asthma, and satisfy my 9-year-old sister's restless spirit. Although it was still May and the school term for my older sister Simone would not be over for another month, my mother, who put first things first, announced that the family would be driving to Lakewood, New Jersey, to spend a week away from the city. Lakewood was then a winter resort, built around a group of small family-style hotels, with one or two grand ones set in a pine forest that surrounded a lake. It was a place of rustic abandonment, first abandoned by the Indians, and then by the Rockefellers, who had settled there for a while, now taken up by prosperous Jews as a resort close by the city. Looking back at this holiday, I can only assume it came about because of my mother's effort to get my father to snap out of it. One of his moods had again put him in an armchair in our living room, staring into space without appetite for his food, or, more significantly, for his radio show favorites, Vic and Sade, Lum and Abner, and the always hilarious Fibber, Bingy, and Molly. These were celebrations of small-town life, a life he had never known, growing up poor on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He might sit like that for days, with tears rolling down from his slightly bulging green eyes, tears which glistened on the stubble of his cheeks, for he had forgotten to shave, a sure sign of his despair in this fastidious man. My father's moods could be read in his shaving habits. A close shave, followed by the splash of a strong aromatic aqua velva aftershave, testified that he was ready to face and fight the world. But the growth of stubble was a sure sign that his depression was now upon him. Of course, in those days, it was called a mood. My mother knew that the travel cure had worked for him in the past. A trip to the Thousand Islands in upstate New York had snapped him out of it early in their marriage, so she had hopes for it to do the trick again in early May of 1937. My father had, in recent years, started his own woolen business, one that had proven more successful than they had hoped in the Depression, and my mother was deeply concerned that his business partner, the shrewd and gregarious Max, would regret his decision to join forces with the unpredictable Nat, a master salesman when well, but a total loss when the mood possessed him. She knew that she had to act quickly to break the latest spell before it ballooned to an unmanageable size and threatened to destroy our newly prosperous lives. I was then 5 years and 4 months old, while my sister was 9. Our Oldsmobile touring sedan was loaded with far too much baggage for the trip. Overpacking is a family tradition that I carry on to this day. All those extra handkerchiefs and underpants, as if nosebleeds and incontinence were the consequence of leaving home. It was, at most, a 4-hour drive from New York City, but given my father's propensity for getting lost, we arrived nearly 6 hours later at Light's Hotel in Lakewood, our retreat for 10 days. Simone, as ever, was carsick and exhausted from various stops devoted to what I even then considered her recreational vomiting along the roadside, where I was sent to perform a precautionary pee in the bushes, whether I had to do so or not. There were few roadside amenities in those days, and if there had been, my cautious mother would not have trusted them for cleanliness. Having grown up in a world of filthy, crowded tenements and the illness and death that accompany that world, she had made her god of cleanliness, the ideal being spotless, and she worshipped it with Murphy's oil soap and Old Dutch cleanser, and scrub brushes with bristles hard enough to demolish any smudge or germ in sight. These were her incense and devotional candles, and she had as strong a faith in them as a devout Catholic woman might have in her rosary. Arriving at the hotel at last and entering the lobby, my mother took the pen from my father's faltering hand and signed the register for the family in the modest reception area, dominated by a painting on black velvet of a rabbi, eyes lifted heavenwards, lost in prayer, facing an equally large velvet painting of Hamlet contemplating Yorick's skull. I stared at the skull, fascinated, and my mother pulled me away, unwilling to start our holiday off with my contemplation of death on black velvet. The elderly bellboy, who told us that he was Annie Light's brother, was so stooped with age that my father, a man of limitless compassion, was roused temporarily from his depression and insisted upon helping him with the luggage, which was then piled into a birdcage elevator, a space so small that it required that my father sit on our suitcases to make room for the operator. The conveyance of baggage and Yellens could not be accomplished without two separate trips in that noisy, jerky contraption. We entered into a two-room suite, which my mother sniffed suspiciously for mold and eyed for signs of dust, but she was soon reassured when the small embroidered handkerchief she ran across the bureau top exonerated the suspicious-looking dark mahogany furniture, and she soon smiled, delighted by the room's fine view of the woods. Determining that there were no dangerous allergens in the room that could bring on my asthma attack, she put her alligator handbag down on the bureau, a sign that she was prepared to stay. Soon she rang for the housekeeper, and after giving the woman the decorative satin cushion with its picture of the pine forest and its stitched motto, Lakewood, Land of Health, a pillow stuffed with pine needles and God knows what other hidden dangers, she was satisfied that the room was finally safe for me. "It's exactly what you need, Nat," my mother declared, although he could not have been unaware that it was my needs that were first attended to. He nodded, not knowing what he needed, least of all the sight of a pine tree. It was clearly what she needed, and even in his misery he knew that a vacation with him was not as welcome as one from him, and from what was then called Nat's troubles. The thought of being imprisoned with him within the apartment, not knowing when, if ever, he would become the familiar, cheerful, mendacious, and angry Nat again, must have been terrifying for my mother. She had made her peace with what he was, for, most of all, he was a good provider. This depression of his was stronger than her own fierce will and her talent as a wife and mother to transform such hard realities. She had dealt with all kinds of physical illness in her youth, illness that had led to the deaths of those she loved the most, but she was at a loss when confronted by mental illness, living as she did in a world where you got over it, forgot about it, or put it out of your mind with the ease that long practice in the art of survival had given to her. This was hardly the case with my father, who had suffered an equally impoverished youth, but who plunged into his depressions like a deep-sea diver cutting through the icy water to arrive at the depths and, having made it that far, was determined to stay until he found a treasure, that being the oblivion that might stop his ferocious and untamed worry. Although they could have afforded the luxurious Laurel in the Pines, the premier hotel of the area, and a few years later we would spend our holidays there, my mother preferred the smaller, unpretentious Hamish Light's Hotel, run by Annie Light, a former actress in Polish Yiddish theater, a resort where a man like my father, who seldom spoke, was okay as long as he did not turn away food, unthinkable. A resort where he would not attract particular notice, given the odd clientele who inhabited its public rooms. That year, the hotel was filled with Madame Light's fellow actors from the touring Yiddish theater company, which was rehearsing for a performance to be given in the town for one night only at the local movie theater, a theater which had years before been a vaudeville house and had retained its proscenium stage and its velvet curtains. A poster of a distraught old woman with arms outstretched toward the heavens, advertising Queen Lear in English, followed by Yiddish writing, was placed on the reception desk in the way of an advertisement. Much to my mother's disapproval, the women of the acting company wore silk pajamas throughout the day, kept their tinted and waved hair in curlers and cobweb fine nets as they lounged around at the breakfast buffet, skipping lunch, but appearing again for dinner, where they gave my mother dark, dirty looks once they learned that she was not one of them, not a woman of the theater, and that her great beauty served no purpose but to bear two children and marry this silent, disturbing, unprepossessing man. My mother's great secret was that she had been a fashion model during World War I, something that was a source of shame rather than pride, one of those memories that were best buried alive. For her part, my mother could barely hide her disapproval of these smoking, loud-laughing, and probably promiscuous women in their Chinese silk pajamas, frog fastenings askew, flourishing ivory and silver cigarette holders, women whose breasts could be spied bouncing freely under their pajama tops, unadorned by brassiere or even a slip. Since I was too young, and my father was beyond looking at vagabond breasts, my mother was more concerned by the influence these women might have on my 9-year-old sister, who had an eye for anything that passed for glamour, and was already indulging her dream of future movie stardom by wearing peasant blouses, exposing her shapely young neck down to her shoulders. What was hardest for my mother was that we had made our reservation on what was then called the American plan, which meant that 3 meals a day were included in the price of the room. This meant that there would be no escape from these dire influences at mealtimes if we were to get our money's worth. Despite his silences, my father continued to read the newspapers piled up in the small smoking lounge, week-old issues of Variety, a day-old New York Times, and his favorite, the World Telegram. It was in one of these papers that he undoubtedly read that the great airship Hindenburg, the Zeppelin of all Zeppelins, was to make a landing the following day in nearby Lakehurst, where it would deposit its cargo of millionaire passengers traveling from Germany to America. It was a first luxury transatlantic crossing, advertising the smoothness of its ride in its beautifully appointed gondola, and bound to change the nature of transcontinental travel. One of my father's great pleasures was being a witness to history. He took true pleasure in telling me how he had attended the great Victory Parade in New York City in 1918, led by General Pershing, which marked the return of our soldiers from France. And 10 years later, he had taken my mother to watch Lindbergh being celebrated on Fifth Avenue with a ticker-tape parade after his solo flight to Europe. He would be in Yankee Stadium to hear Lou Gehrig deliver his farewell speech to baseball and life. And whenever he witnessed something grand in the company of others, it made him lose his terrible loneliness and feel one with the crowd. He would become cheerful, his natural state, and laugh for days afterwards,
finding a comfort that was nowhere to be found in the humdrum events of everyday life.
Lakehurst was an hour's drive from our hotel, and based upon what I would later come to know of him, it would seem imperative for him to see the famous airship arrive and watch it being moored to its landing mast. Perhaps this would get him to snap out of it. The newspaper had assured him that this was an historic event not to be missed, and his proximity to it was like an electric shock, stimulating him to rise from his lethargy and make a plan. Why he lied to my mother that day, I will never know, although I now suspect that he would be hard-pressed to explain to my mother why he wished to greet the landing of an airship that sported large swastikas on its landing gear and cabin. By 1937, it was universally known that Hitler and the Nazis were bad for the Jews, that the racial laws were in effect, and that those few Jews who could manage it were trying to leave Germany with little more than their lives. None of these passengers would be escaping Jews. On board the commodious gondola of the airship would be the high German bourgeoisie who had voted Hitler into power, enjoying the historic luxury crossing that would put Germany at the top of world travel. It would be too hard to explain to her that he needed to see something remarkable, something greater than his own despair, in order to get through to tomorrow. So he told her that he wished to take me on a visit to an egg farm. At least the ovular shape of the Zeppelin and that of an egg had something in common. The conversation between my mother and father, as ever, took the form of a skeptical question from my mother, followed by a mendacious yet probable answer from my father. "Why does he have to see an egg farm?" my mother asked. "The boy should learn something about where our food comes from," he replied, stating that I was a city child, and he did not want me to imagine that our eggs were hatched in the A&P. He told her not to worry if we did not arrive back in time for the first seating of dinner. If we were going to be late, he would take me to a diner, where I would have a malted milk and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, my favorites. My mother was skeptical about this, given his mental condition, but she could not argue with him, as she knew he would never do anything to injure me, and that he drove his car slowly and carefully. "You'll be taking Simone, too?" she asked, eager to get my sister away from the pernicious influence of those Yiddish theater actresses. She had caught my sister studying her own face in the underside of a spoon at breakfast that morning, and using a strawberry from the breakfast table to redden her lips. My mother feared that the vanity of these loose women was all too contagious. My father reminded her that Simone was carsick more often than not, and what would be a nice outing for Nathaniel and son would probably be a torment for his daughter. "I don't know how smart this is," my mother said, still uneasy about our trip. "It looks like rain." My father made a dismissive gesture with his hand that carried the message, "Lil, stop the foolish worrying." She was so pleased by this sign of his spirits being lifted to an action, days earlier than planned, that she finally agreed to the outing. So it was decided that we would visit the egg farm as an all-male outing. And indeed we did. Lakewood and nearby Lakehurst were magnets for European Jews, fearful of city ghettos, who wanted to start over in America in a simple, inexpensive agricultural setting. They wanted dirt roads leading to small farms, Eastern Europe in New Jersey, and they found it there. Land was cheap, and the purchase of a few breeding chickens, roosters, and Rhode Island Reds was a small investment compared to the seeds, plow, and help that a farmer who depended on agricultural crops, good rain but not too much rain, sun but not too much sun, might need for his survival. Growing Jersey tomatoes was beyond their means. And besides, the chicken farmer felt connected to his old country in ways that the tomato grower could never be. Nobody in Poland or Russia grew tomatoes. Wheat, okay. Corn, maybe. But it was poultry that smelled and behaved in ways that made the farmer and his wife imagine, if only for the moment, that they were back in the village of their birth among farm animals who understood their language. My father purchased a dozen large brown eggs at the first farm we visited. Although looking back at that day, it is hard to figure what he planned to do with them, since no cooking was allowed in the hotel's guest rooms. My mother, of course, traveled with a one-ring electric burner to take the chill out of the glass milk bottle she kept on the windowsill, so that my sister and I should not suffer stomach cramps. But cooking eggs was out of the question. After consulting his map and marking his route with a red pencil, we were soon driving toward the Lakehurst Naval Airfield. My father's eagerness to witness the Hindenburg when it docked there could not be contained. As we arrived at the airfield, he soon took me into his confidence, telling me, "Son, I have a treat in store for you. You are going to see the largest airship in the world land in the airfield. It's something to stick in your memory book." He was a firm believer in the value of memory books, and as I write this, I have come to agree with him. Airfields meant adventure for me. Once, that past summer, he had hired the pilot of a one-engine biplane at Floyd Bennett Field to take us for an hour's ride over the skyscrapers of New York City. Amazingly, my sister was not airsick, and we were both thrilled by the ride, although we were obliged to promise not to tell our mother. When Simone broke that promise immediately upon our arrival home, my mother could barely contain her anger, and she was not an angry woman by nature. "Were you crazy?" she asked him, although it was an accusation and not a question. "If I ever hear of you doing anything like that again, I will never let you take them out for a drive," she exhorted. He nodded repentantly, but winked at me when she was not looking. I was hoping that something similar was planned for this evening, but there were no planes for hire on this field. Indeed, it was a field empty of all airplanes. At the Lakehurst airstrip, a small crowd, comprised of some spectators, a few reporters, and relatives of the passengers, waiting for the arrival of the great airship, had gathered on the field. The landing field looked to me like a giant sandbox. Standing in the middle of this field was an enormous post, which my father explained to me was the mooring post to which the landing gear of the great airship would be tethered before it settled on the sandy field to enable its passengers to descend on a portable staircase to terra firma. Time passed. Too much time for a 5-year-old to tolerate standing still. I was growing restless and bored. The same feeling I had when I was obliged to sit through a double-header in Yankee Stadium, which went well beyond its 9 innings. A feeling that whatever was to happen had no end, that I was stuck forever in the middle of something I did not fully comprehend, as I watched my father cheer his team, and I kept the scorecard of the hits, runs, and errors for a game without an exit. The airship was now an hour later than its scheduled arrival time, and the sky had begun to darken. A light rain began to fall, at first as easy as a mist, and then real raindrops hit our heads. My father opened his umbrella to cover my head, pulled out his pocket watch, and looked concerned. He knew that if we did not return before nightfall, my mother would worry, and he would have a hard time explaining his tardiness, particularly with the rain. He looked around for a paid telephone booth, but there was none in that field. As he started to walk with me back to the car, holding tightly to my hand, suddenly the great egg was looming above us, emerging from within the dark clouds in the silvery skin of the great airship itself. I was delighted. It reminded me of the great whale I had seen when my father had first taken us to the Museum of Natural History. My father looked at the descending airship with undisguised admiration, shouting at me, "Look! Look! Look!" But the clouds had darkened again and smeared the sky with a blackish gray, and the airship, which now and again peeped out from those clouds, seemed to hang above us uncertainly, a dim shape now, barely discernible from below. I looked up at my father as he whistled to the airship to come closer, as if he were summoning a dog. I knew at once that it was something wonderful, but to me it seemed less remarkable than the giant balloon of Popeye that I had seen floating down 34th Street in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, one that had dipped down very close to my sister and caused a commotion at the time. Suddenly, I felt myself being scooped up from the ground and placed upon my father's shoulders so that I could see the landing from above the heads of the waiting crowd of friends and relatives of the passengers. A sea of fedora hats and gloved hands, waving to their friends encased in the gondola on that chilly, rain-doused evening. Later, many years later, I was to learn that the airship was obliged to make a sharp left turn at full speed because the ground crew had failed to prepare properly for the landing. It was about 7 in the evening when, after a few more sharp turns, the mooring lines were dropped from the bow, just as static electricity began to move from the airship's underside to its hull. And then it happened. The airship was afire. The flames began to spread, moving forward, and the airship's back was soon broken. The red letters Hindenburg disappeared into the flames, along with the swastika, the fabric skin burning away and swallowing the airship cell by cell as it crashed to the ground, nose first, with a hideous fiery verticality. I could hear the screams and the cries of the passengers, and the gasps of horror from those waiting below as the gondola hit the ground and the airship's skin was rapidly peeling away. It appeared to glow from within, like a Japanese lantern, sparks flying everywhere, delightful for a child to look at, but ending in a fierce explosion lost in a thunderclap, while a few fortunate passengers and crew started dropping from the airship gondola that was close to the ground. The waiting crew on the ground rushed toward the flaming wreckage. I can still recall the sight of a man running towards us. He was immaculately groomed, pristine in his uniform, only his cap and his face were ablaze, and to my mind he looked more like a living birthday candle than a human being. My father hurriedly shook me off his shoulders and tossed me to a standing position on the ground. For a moment he pushed my face into his stomach against the hard metal buckle of his belt so that I would not see what was then happening. I felt him grab my hand, and, like all the screaming, blazing figures around us, we too began to run as I was dragged along by him, my head turned toward the blazing man, hoping to get a better look as my father pulled me towards our car. Most of all, I wanted to see more of that blazing airship, which had taken on the features of an immense dying dragon wrapped in its own flames. It was something that I found oddly reassuring, because it meant that the chimeras that plagued my sleep with nightmares had their counterparts in the real world, and did not live only in my head. In a moment, I found myself thrown into the rear passenger seat of the Oldsmobile, my head covered with the Turkish towels that were always placed there in the event that my sister should throw up without warning. These towels were to prevent me from witnessing more of the catastrophe. He started up the engine, making his getaway, and we raced out of the airstrip. "Daddy, what happened?" I asked. "Just fireworks," my father replied. "Only, you mustn't tell your mother that we went to see them. You know how she is about fireworks." I did know. The preceding summer, when we were at Long Beach on Long Island, she had refused to let me stay up to see the fireworks display on the 4th of July. She had read about accidental explosions at such displays, and did not want to encourage any of my incurable curiosity that might lead to danger. I was even forbidden to hold a sparkler, something my young friends had all accomplished. After driving for a short while, as fire engines with screaming sirens passed us going in the opposite direction, my father pulled over to the side of the road and examined me. He took out his handkerchief, spat on it, and proceeded to rub off some ash that had landed on my nose. Then, satisfied that there was no telltale sign of our disastrous outing, he proceeded to drive back to the hotel. "Just fireworks," he explained. "That's all it was, son." At 5, I already knew that he was lying to me, that this was no simple fireworks display. But I also knew that there was nothing to be gained from asking him any more questions, other than having him lose his temper with me for distracting him from the nest of lies he was diligently weaving for my mother. When we returned to the hotel an hour later, my mother and sister were waiting. "Did you hear what happened to the big Nazi Zeppelin?" my mother asked. "No," my father lied. And she proceeded to tell him of the awful accident that had been reported on the radio, and was all the talk of the hotel. The next morning, when Herb Morrison's recorded account of the airship disaster was first broadcast, Mrs. Light sneered when she heard him cry out, "Oh, the humanity!" "He is wrong," she said. "Those were not humans who died. They were Nazis, and that was God punishing them for what they're doing to the Jews in Germany." It was then that my father presented Mrs. Light with a dozen farm-fresh eggs and asked her to serve them to us for breakfast, graciously telling her to take some for herself and her brother. I never again heard any discussion of the Hindenburg disaster at Light's Hotel, nor did I betray my father, knowing that what we had witnessed was a forbidden secret which we alone could share. Keeping that secret did not hang heavily upon my 5-year-old conscience. It was better than those interminable double-headers. In time, I would forget about that evening. All I would recall was the sharp metal of my father's belt buckle as he pressed my head into it to keep me from witnessing any more of the disaster, and the way he tossed me into the back of the automobile, the rough texture of the towels against my face and arms as we sped off like bank robbers in a getaway. But I never forgot the flames within the ribs of the airship and the burning man. Listening to the radio a few years later, Clifton Fadiman, on Information Please, began to discuss the burning of the Hindenburg, and I realized that I had witnessed it, but that I could never boast of it without betraying my father, or worse, being accused of lying. And, strange as it seemed, the day after the accident, my father appeared to have recovered from this bout of depression. Indeed, as my mother would later report to her sister Ida, Nat finally snapped out of it. Must have been that trip to the farm. Leave it to him to find the freshest eggs in Lakewood. Oh, the humanity. Years later, as my father lay dying of pancreatic cancer in his hospital bed at Mount Sinai Hospital, I brought up the subject of the Hindenburg. I told him that I had such vivid memories of being present at that event, yet I could not be sure if it was a true recollection or a child's fusion of dream and reality. I recounted my remembrance of that day, and he registered no emotion. Had we visited the landing field at Lakehurst before or after the event, and had I only imagined the historic event that occurred there, a recollection that had lasted with me through the decades? Were we really there? I asked him. He looked at me, silent for a moment, and then, for the last time in his life, offered me the small, shy, turned-up corners of his mouth that always preceded some guilty statement, and said, "Yes, son, I took you there. But, for God's sake, don't tell your mother."